Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan and welcome to This Week in the Italian Campaign, a weekly live stream about the Italian campaign which started with the Allied landings in Sicily 80 years ago in July 1943. My guests and I will be discussing critical moments in the Italian campaign, the Cassibile Armistice, Operation Slapstick and the capture of Taranto, and the start of the Salerno landings. But first, we will talk about the downfall of Benito Mussolini. The psychological foundations for Italy to abandon the Axis and join the Allies in 1943 were laid by the defeats in East and North Africa on the Eastern Front in the previous 3 years. By September 1943, Italy had lost more than 500,000 men killed, wounded or taken prisoner. Around 1.7 more were serving in the armed forces, reducing the labour available for farm and industrial production. The Allied blockade led to fuel and raw material shortages. Allied bombers have been hitting Italian cities since Mussolini declared war against Britain and France on the 10th of June 1940. From February 1942, British strategy shifted to the area bombing of cities to wreck civilian morale. On 18th of November 1942, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a cable to President Roosevelt that said, "All the industrial centres should be attacked in an intense fashion, every effort being made to render them uninhabitable and to terrorise and paralyse the population." Two days later, Foreign Minister Anthony Eden penned a secret memorandum echoing Churchill's sentiments. The demoralisation and panic produced by intensive heavy air bombardments no doubt outweigh any increase in anti-British feeling. On balance, therefore, there is everything to be said for keeping up and increasing our heavy, indiscriminate raids on Italian cities. In 1943, the Allies dropped more than 10,000 tons of bombs on Italian cities, twice the tonnage used in the Blitz against Britain in 1940 and 1941. By March 1943, more than 100,000 Italian homes had been destroyed. These attacks increased in early 1943 when the US took over the bulk of the bombing duties in South Italy. Allied planners believed air attacks on northern Italian cities where the population was most opposed to the fascist regime would help convince them to overthrow it. A US intelligence analysis in July 1943 predicted that heavy air bombardment might possibly bring about a leftist revolution. Evidence of collapsing domestic morale came in March 1943 when a strike at the Fiat factory in Turin spread across Piedmont and Lombardy. On the 19th of July, in an Allied air attack on Rome, 690 US aircraft dropped 1,000 tons of bombs on the Chiappino and Littorio airfields and on the Littorio and San Lorenzo marshalling yards. More than 1,500 people were killed in the daylight raid. It was to prove to be the last straw for the Mussolini regime. On the 2nd of February 1943, Germany's Sixth Army surrendered in Stalingrad. In North Africa in the same month, Axis forces were retreating through Libya to the Tunisian border. Mussolini had told Hitler in December 1942 that the Axis needed to concentrate its resources, make a deal with the Soviet Union, and defend the Mediterranean. On the 6th of February 1943, Mussolini carried out the most wide-ranging government reshuffle in 21 years of fascist power in a bid to increase his personal support. But at a meeting in Kleisheim on the 29th of April, Hitler rejected Mussolini's proposal for a separate peace with Moscow and for the bulk of the German army to be moved south. A request for reinforcements to defend Tunis was refused. Axis resistance in Tunisia ended on the 13th of May. Mussolini by then was depressed and sick. Seeking to bolster his will to resist following the Allied landings in Sicily, Hitler asked to meet Mussolini as soon as possible. The meeting took place on the 19th of July in Feltre, in northern Italy. Mussolini was accompanied by his new Chief of the General Staff, General Vittorio Ambrosio, and his top foreign policy advisor, Giovanni Bastianini. Ambrosio told Mussolini that it was his duty to exit the war within 15 days. Hitler spent most of the meeting haranguing Mussolini about the poor performance of the Italian armed forces. Mussolini's spirits were further depressed when the meeting was interrupted with news that Rome had been bombed earlier that day. Mussolini left early from a meeting that was planned to take 3 days, having failed to argue Italy's case effectively. In Rome the next day, Mussolini told Ambrosio he planned to write to Hitler to say that Italy was obliged to abandon the alliance with Germany, but it was, by then, too late. The king's tolerance of Mussolini was based on the belief that Mussolini's personal relationship with Hitler could be used to secure agreement for Italy to leave the Axis. Ambrosio, by then too, had lost faith for a coup to replace him was set in motion. Mussolini's rule had been built on a coalition. Fascists who shared his totalitarian vision, conservatives including the king and the church, and the military who benefited from higher defence spending and hoped for career opportunities in Italy's expanding empire. The military and economic crisis engulfing Italy in 1943 shattered this coalition. On the 21st of July, Mussolini called for a meeting of the 28-member Fascist Grand Council, the regime's supreme decision-making body. The following day, he told the king that he had decided to get Italy out of the war by the 15th of September. The king supported Mussolini's plan. The meeting of the council began at 5 p.m. on the afternoon of the 24th of July in Rome's Palazzo Venezia and ended at 2 the next morning following a vote 19-8 in favour of a resolution that affirmed the king's supreme sovereignty, including over the fascist party. Mussolini returned to his home in Villa Tolonia, convinced that Italian fascism was finished. He wasn't wrong. The king was informed of the vote in the Grand Council at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 25th of July and called former Chief of Staff Marshal Pietro Badoglio to tell him that he was to succeed Mussolini. Mussolini asked for a meeting with the king that afternoon. At the meeting, the king told him that the country was broken, he must resign, and that the new president of the Council of Ministers would be Marshal Badoglio. After leading the meeting, Mussolini was arrested at 5 o'clock. At 10:45, a communiqué announced Mussolini's replacement as Prime Minister by Badoglio. Thank you. Okay, well now I'm joined by Giulio Poggiaroni, who runs the Italian Military Archives page on YouTube, Twitter and Instagram, where he focuses on the Italian armed forces in World War II, with special attention to the Navy. He also writes for the website Commander Supremo, where you can find plenty of articles in English about Italy during the Second World War. Well, Giulio, great to see you. You're based in Turin in Italy, in Tuscany in Italy. Yeah. Thanks for joining us today on This Week in the Italian campaign. So let's get straight into the question in hand. And the one that I really want you to address is, was Mussolini's deposition there on the 25th of July, was that inevitable? Was there an alternative that the Italian government could have taken?
Hi, Eddie. So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Answering to your question, I would say, yes, it was inevitable at that point. You perfectly explained in your presentation that the sequence of defeats and in Africa and Tunisia, then also on the Eastern Front, and then the failure of Mussolini in pressing Hitler to find a solution, find a negotiation with the Soviet Union. He failed in this. He was also becoming more ill, depressed, and this did not help. And you see that by late 1942, early 1943, there are more and more people in the Italian elite growing unhappy with the situation because they feel that the moment is dire and something must be done.
Well, let me just interrupt you then at this point, Julia. I mean, was this an anti-fascist coup? Was it was it a
First look,
fascist coup, or was it? I mean, was it against the fascist regime, or was it fascists in the regime wanted to change things, or just get rid of
it,
Mussolini? Was it about getting rid of them? What was it really about?
it's everything you just said, but it was not a coup. Um, so from a legal perspective, uh, we could claim that everything was perfectly legal. So it was not really a coup d'état as we think of, as we imagine it. The thing is, it was the conflux of different parties, let's say. One was the fascist, the group of fascist leaders, Dino Grandi, Ciano, all the others who actually voted against Mussolini in the Grand Council. On the other side, you have the army. You mentioned Vittorio Ambrosio, who was very keen on pressing Mussolini to find a solution and taking Italy out of the war. But then, of course, Ambrosio and the army leadership were strictly tied to the king. The king was well aware that the situation was dire and Italy had to pull out of the war. The problem lies with the fact that the only person in Italy that could start this change of regime was the king. And the king was very insecure. He was waiting for a strong supporter, a very specific event to take action. And actually, he saw the vote in the Grand Council of Fascism as this kind of event that could allow him to act against Mussolini. Because we have also to remember that there were people fearing the reaction of the fascist party, of the militia. This did not materialize. And in fact, many people were kind of surprised of how easy at the end was to depose Mussolini. I mean, it was hard, but then there was no backlash after that.
So, I mean, the terms. So, as you're pointing out, I mean, I say coup with a small c, stroke against Mussolini, but it was strictly constitutional to the extent that the fascist regime was constitutional. It was constitutional. So the people who plotted the downfall of Mussolini, they weren't seeking to end fascism, were they?
No, actually, the fascists who voted against him in the Grand Council voted for this. They voted for this, let's say, or agenda that stated that the king had to be the supreme powers regarding the control of the armed forces had to be restored to the king, in the hands of the king. This had many implications, political implications. It was, of course, a kind of no confidence vote for Mussolini, but it was written between the lines, let's say. But these fascist people, they saw themselves as the candidates for the next government. Dino Grandi, it's the perfect example. He was expecting to be part of the next government, being the prime minister or being the foreign minister, but this did not happen as the king formed a kind of military junta, a government made of military men.
Okay, well, that takes you into General Badoglio.
Yeah.
Badoglio had a fairly formidable military record, although he had fallen out of favour with Mussolini in the early part of the Second World War. So why was Badoglio chosen above anybody else?
So Badoglio was a general who had gained a lot from the years of Mussolini in power. He was let's say, the conqueror of Ethiopia. He was supreme chief of staff. But then he was removed from his position in late November 1940, after the failure of the invasion of Greece, which was Mussolini was the true responsible person for this, and Badoglio was kind of the scapegoat of this failure. And so since then he had been on the sidelines. He went back to his hometown in Piemonte, and he stayed behind, far away from the political scene, let's say. It was not granted that he was going to be nominated prime minister. There were also some other possible candidates in the mind of the king, like Marshal Caviglia, but at the end he was chosen by the king, probably because of the ties, his authority, his authority among the military elite. So probably this was the choice. Was he the right person? Probably not.
Yes, as history shows. But outside the elites, obviously in Rome, the people at the very top, they're making these decisions. But what does the history show that the attitude amongst the ordinary Italians at this point? I assume their priority was really to get out of the war.
So it's very clear that the announcement of the downfall of Mussolini ignited some acts of jubilees. You see videos of people cheering in the streets, taking down statues and stone heads of Mussolini around the streets. So there was a lot of jubilee because they felt that this downfall was the prelude to the end of the war. The problem is that Badoglio announced that the war continues, and this was met with a lot of, let's say, unsatisfaction among many people. The thing is, he could not do differently in that moment, because we have to think that in their minds they had just made a very big step, removing Mussolini from power, the guy who ruled for more than 20 years. So it was not granted what was going to happen next. So that's also a very complex thing, to take a country out of a war when you have the enemies at the time invading part of the country, and then you have your allies who are starting to move more and more troops in your territory, and you see this with growing suspicion.
Well, exactly. Great point, Giulio, because we're now moving on to the next part of the story, which is the period between the deposition of Mussolini and eventually what happened 80 years ago this weekend, with the armistice being announced in Italy, not only getting out of the war, but actually changing sides. So please stay with us, Giulio. What's going to happen is that we're going to have another package about this period of history. So here it is. So let's return to the chronology of the campaign and consider the Allied perspective. US Chief of Staff General George Marshall had persistently questioned the strategic merit of diverting resources to the Mediterranean, but he had been overruled by President Roosevelt. He shared some of Marshall's doubts, but wanted to maintain close relations with UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill favoured the Mediterranean, including a possible invasion through the Balkans, supported by landings in Norway. These differences were addressed on the 17th to 24th of August at the First Quebec Conference, which was attended by Churchill, Marshall, and Roosevelt. On the first day of the conference, Allied combined chiefs of staff agreed that the Mediterranean theatre would be subordinate to plans for Operation Overlord. To create a diversion from the Normandy landings, there would be landings in southern France. The conference nevertheless set the Rome area as the minimum Allied territorial objective and called for unremitting pressure against German forces in northern Italy. The Allies assumed that Italy would be knocked out of the war and that German forces would not seek to hold the south of the Italian peninsula. Planning for the invasion of the mainland was delegated to General Eisenhower's Allied Forces Headquarters team. It presented an outline of Operation Baytown, the 8th Army crossing of the Strait of Messina, and Operation Avalanche, the Salerno landings, to the combined chiefs on the Quebec Conference's last day. The combination of American and British might was the Allies' greatest strength, but it created an inflexibility that those in Rome failed to appreciate. Their hope was that the deposition of Mussolini might draw a more generous response from the Allies than the demand for unconditional surrender made in Casablanca in January. Let's look at the German perspective. A report to German High Command in May 1943 said that the Italian army had inadequate and insufficient armament and equipment, a faulty officer training, and a lack of spirit among the troops. Only with German support could the Italians repel a large-scale invasion of their homeland. Commander-in-Chief South Field Marshal Albert Kesselring offered up to 5 divisions under Italian tactical control. The swift Allied conquest of Sicily reinforced the German view, but Mussolini's deposition was still a shock. On hearing about it, Hitler's first impulse was to seize Rome, kidnap the king, his family and government, and liberate Mussolini, but he was persuaded against it. On the night of the 26th of July, German commander in the west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was ordered to move 2 divisions towards the Italian border. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had just been posted to Greece, was recalled to Berlin following Mussolini's deposition and ordered to northern Italy to command the reconstituted Army Group B. Under an agreement with Italy's government, the 26th Panzer Division was in Italy and heading south. By the 2nd of August, further formations had entered Italy. A plan was devised, named Axe, which would involve German formations in Italy taking control of the country upon the receipt of a code word. By mid-August, Hitler was convinced, rightly as we shall see, that Rome was in contact with the Allies. The German 10th Army under General Heinrich von Winterhoff was put on alert to prepare for Italy's defection, resist Allied landings, and form a defensive line south of Rome. German forces already in southern Italy were to be withdrawn following the seizure of Italy's capital. By early September, the Germans were ready. The Italian government's attempt to reach out to the Allies was less decisive. On the 30th of July, Italy's foreign minister unsuccessfully attempted to send a message to the British government through the UK ambassador to the Vatican. At a meeting of the Crown Council the following day, his call for an immediate approach to the Allies about a possible armistice was agreed. The King approved the dispatch of an emissary to Lisbon to meet the British ambassador. A senior diplomat flew from Lisbon on the 3rd of August and met the ambassador the next day. No formal response was received to the overture. On the 5th of August, the foreign minister sent a second envoy to Tangier to tell the British consul there that Italy was ready to negotiate. Again, there was no British response. The King authorized the dispatch of a third peace envoy in the form of General Giuseppe Castellano, a long-standing advocate of Italy not just ending the war, but joining the Allies. He left Rome by train on the 12th of August and arrived in Lisbon via Madrid on the evening of the 16th of August. Talk started with a meeting with General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, on the 18th of August. Castellano was told there would be a military armistice that had to be accepted unconditionally. Bedell Smith read out what were known as its short terms, as approved by Churchill and Roosevelt in Quebec on the 31st of July. The Italian government had to communicate its acceptance by the 28th of August, and if no reply came by the 30th of August, the Allies would assume that the terms had been refused. Acceptance of the armistice terms also meant assent to the method of announcement, a radio broadcast by General Eisenhower with 5 or 6 hours preliminary warning to Italy. Castellano left by train on the 23rd of August and reached Rome 4 days later. Meanwhile, concerned by the lack of information from Castellano, the king approved a second envoy to be sent to Portugal, General Giacomo Zanuzzi. He flew to Lisbon on the 25th of August with Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart, a celebrated British prisoner of war since 1941, as evidence of his credentials and as cover. Zanuzzi had been briefed to urge the Allies against fighting their way up the peninsula, but to land in force near Rome. In Lisbon, he was given what was named as the long form of the terms of the proposed armistice, which had been approved by Churchill and Roosevelt on the 26th of August. It included the phrase unconditional surrender, which was not mentioned in the short form that Castellano was at that moment carrying to Rome. While this was happening, plans for the invasion of the mainland were being finalized at Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers. Aware of the strength of German forces, Allied planners wanted reassurance that Italy wouldn't fight too, but Eisenhower doubted Castellano could persuade Rome to accept the conditions of the short terms, let alone the long terms with its harsh initial statement of unconditional surrender. He received authorization to proceed, apparently deceitfully, with negotiations with Castellano on the basis of the short armistice terms. There were fears that Zanuzzi would use Italy's Lisbon embassy to inform Rome of the long terms and nullify Castellano's negotiations. Zanuzzi was relieved of his copy of the long terms and flown to Gibraltar and from there to Algiers on the 28th of August for further talks. Castellano had by then reached Rome with the short terms. The response there was that an armistice could only be announced after the landing of at least 15 Allied divisions, mainly on the coast north of Rome, to protect Italy from any German reaction to the news that Italy was abandoning the Axis. But there was enough common ground for negotiations to start. On the 31st of August, Castellano flew from Rome to Sicily, where Bedell Smith, the UK Minister to the Mediterranean Harold Macmillan, and Roosevelt's personal representative Robert Murphy had arrived earlier that morning with General Zanuzzi. Negotiations began in Cassibile, south of Syracuse, with the two Italian generals and 15th Army Group Commander Harold Alexander, Bedell Smith, and other Allied representatives. The Allies insisted that the landings and the announcement of the armistice had to be simultaneous and refused to reveal where the landings would occur, though it was clear they would be well south of Rome. That evening, Castellano and Zanuzzi flew back to Rome. Badoglio was informed the next day that they had been unable to obtain the promise that the armistice would only be announced after the main Allied landings, which he had wrongly guessed would take place on the 12th to 15th September. The king approved the armistice, but Badoglio took no steps to mobilize the Italian army against German reprisals, though Army Chief General Iwata secretly sent orders for preparations to fight. Castellano flew back to Sicily on the 2nd of September. He received final authority to approve the 416-word armistice at 5 p.m. the next day. 15 minutes later, Castellano signed the armistice treaty on behalf of Badoglio. Bedell Smith signed for Eisenhower, who had flown from North Africa to witness the ceremony, which took place in a tent. After dinner with General Alexander, Castellano was handed the long form of the armistice, which stated that it was part of the short form that Castellano had signed, but he had never seen it before. It contained the phrase, "The Italian land, sea, and air forces, wherever located, hereby surrender unconditionally." Operation Baytown, the 8th Army crossing of the Strait of Messina, had been successfully completed earlier that day. Plans for the 5th Army under Mark Clark to land at Salerno on the 9th of September were being executed. In Cassibile, Castellano and the Allied commanders turned their minds to the Allied promise that the US 82nd Airborne Division would land near Rome as agreed with Castellano to protect the city. To confirm its details, the division's Chief of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, and Air Army Colonel Gardner left Palermo in a British motor torpedo boat early on the 7th of September to rendezvous off Ustica Island with an Italian corvette. It escorted them to a beach near Gaeta, from where they travelled by road to Rome. There, Badoglio, shocked that the Allied landings well south of Rome were due to start in less than 2 days, told them he wanted the airborne landing cancelled. No declaration of an immediate armistice was possible because of the strength of German forces around Rome. Taylor radioed a message cancelling the planned landings. He and Gardner left Rome on the afternoon of the 8th of September and flew to Bizerte in Tunis to brief Eisenhower. Eisenhower believed Italy had reneged on its agreement with the Allies and sent an angry message to Badoglio saying he would announce the armistice regardless. At 18:30 on the 8th of September, Eisenhower broadcast the news of the armistice from Radio Algiers. At 18:30 on the 8th of September, Eisenhower broadcast the news of the armistice from Radio Algiers. This is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Forces. The Italian government has surrendered its armed forces unconditionally. As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice, the terms of which have been approved by the governments of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Thus, I am acting in the interests of the United Nations. The Italian government has bound itself by these terms without reservation. The armistice was signed by my representative and the representative of Marshal Badoglio, and it becomes effective this instant. Hostilities between the armed forces of the United Nations and those of Italy terminate at once. All Italians who now act to help eject the German aggressor from Italian soil will have the assistance and support of the United Nations. After waiting 10 minutes, Eisenhower authorized Radio Algiers to broadcast in English the text of Badoglio's proclamation, which had been previously agreed and which had significantly different content. The Italian government, recognizing the impossibility of continuing the unequal struggle against the overwhelming power of the enemy, with the object of avoiding further and more grievous harm to the nation, has requested an armistice from General Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Anglo-American Allied Force. This request has been granted. The Italian forces will therefore cease all acts of hostility against the Anglo-American forces wherever they may be met. They will, however, oppose attacks from any other quarter. The broadcast stunned Badoglio, but the king said Italy had to honour the armistice. Badoglio went on radio at 7:45 to read out the proclamation already transmitted by the Allies. Italian forces around Rome erected roadblocks that allowed departing Germans through, but stopped any coming into the city. Clashes between German and Italian troops were quickly reported. By 4 o'clock on the 9th of September, German forces had almost sealed off Rome. It was decided that the king and the royal family, Badoglio and senior government officials should immediately leave Rome. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the royal family set off for Pescara, to be followed soon after by the rest of the government entourage. From there, it sailed to Brindisi, where it arrived in the afternoon of the 10th of September. The city was declared to be Italy's new capital. As the king headed along the highway to Pescara at dawn on the 9th of September, Allied troops were heading for landing beaches south of Salerno. We shall deal with the Salerno operation next week, but now let's discuss the impact of errors and wishful thinking between the fall of Mussolini and the announcement of the armistice. I am joined again by Giulio Poggiaroni, who runs the Italian Military Archives page on YouTube, Twitter and Instagram, where he focuses on the Italian armed forces in World War II, with special attention to the Navy. Well, there, Giulio, that's a lot of information about what happened between the deposition of Mussolini that we discussed and his arrest on the 25th of July and the eventual announcement by Eisenhower. Both, he sent out that the Italians had actually had unconditionally surrendered, which is something which I'm not sure had been entirely agreed in Rome, and then also a text which suggested that the Italians might consider joining and fight with the Allies against somebody else, unspecified. No declaration against war against Germany, nothing else of that nature. So let's get into the stuff again, Giulio. Just looking at the situation between the 25th of July and the 9th over that period, a lot of moving parts. You have the Germans, the British, the Americans, the Italian government, and it's not unified. But could the Italian government have acted differently in this period to make it less chaotic as things happen, as they became?
So that's a very tough question, but I would say that the Italian government was tasked with an almost impossible mission, and the people that were tasked to carry out this mission were perhaps the less adequate to carry it on. There was a lot of indecision, this obsession with secrecy because they feared the German reaction, although the Germans were already sure that the Italians were going to betray them after the downfall of Mussolini. Of course, betraying in the perspective of the Germans, because Italy was a sovereign nation who rightfully could decide to abandon the struggle because the war was lost. So the government is in this very difficult position where you have the Germans starting to move more troops to the country, something like an enemy occupation. So the government rushes to start negotiating with the Allies. And you mentioned in the presentation the travel of General Castellano to Lisbon. Before reaching Lisbon, he meets the British ambassador in Madrid, Samuel Hoare, and there he speaks for the first time about the possibility of Italy joining the Allies against the Germans. This is comes as a news for the Allies, and at that time, Churchill and Roosevelt are meeting in Quebec. They are given this news, and this will lead to the drafting of the so-called Quebec Declaration, which was a piece of document, let's say an annex to the Armistice, which stated that in the case of an Italian military help against the Germans, the terms of the Armistice could be softened. And this was very important because it will play a role in the events after the declaration of the Armistice. For instance, the fleet, the Italian battle fleet, will be saved because of the existence of this document. Let's say the Minister of the Navy will explain to his commanders that the Navy should not be scuttled. This should be transferred to the Allied ports because this will give a great contribution to the nation after at the end of the war. So this is very important. And again, you explained very well that the situation is very complex, many actors, but the thing is, the Italians were in a very difficult situation, and yeah, the Italian government did not behave in the best way. Also, they were expecting the landings to be perhaps after the 8th, after the 10th of September, so they are guilty of not preparing the army, the armed forces in general, to do what they were supposed to do.
Absolutely, and that was manifested in the response to the German takeover that happened very quickly. Now, what about the Allies? I mean, talking about the Italians, of course, you can speculate the Italian government could have done a lot of different things. What about the Allies? Do you think the Allies' approach here was, in the end, worked well for themselves? And did it work well for Italy and the Italian people?
So I think the Allies were rightfully suspicious of the of the Italians, because at some points the Italians were, during the negotiations, where they were requesting information about the landings, the locations, the amount of the troops involved, and they were very adamant in not telling the date of the landings, because they were still enemies at the time. So it was, I see the point of the Allies is in not making the Italians perfectly aware of the situation. On the side, the Italians, General Castellano had provided a lot of intelligence about the position and consistency of the German forces in Italy. So this was, of course, welcome, but maybe not seen as a sufficient element of trustworthiness. I'm thinking this. And so maybe the Allies did not behave rightfully, but they did not. They saw the opportunity posed by the end of the hostilities with the Italians, because we have to remember that at that point the Allies are concerned about opening the second front in France, and they are slowly giving all the priorities, the landing craft, the ships, to this upcoming endeavor. And so the Italian front is already becoming a secondary front. The opportunity of continuing the Italian campaign is facilitated by the end of the hostilities with the Italians. But perhaps one of the errors that the Allies committed, and also the Italians committed, was the underestimation of the German reaction, because it was believed by many that with the Italians declaring the armistice, the Germans would have withdrawn north of the Apennines, so north of Tuscany, to give you an idea. So the Allies could move faster, liberate Rome, and then the government would have returned to Rome after the run to Pescara and then Brindisi. This was the idea. But then also the Germans probably were of this mind. It is known that they were burning documents in Rome. But then with the unfolding events, Kesselring saw the opportunity of staying and fighting the beachheads in Salerno. And then he initiated this gamble that eventually paid off, because with this behavior, he delayed the Italian campaign by 10 to 9 months, let's say, because Rome could have been liberated perhaps at the end of September or early October instead of June 1944. So there's a lot in play in these chaotic weeks.
Yes, absolutely, and it's. I would encourage any viewers to acquaint themselves more with the detailed history of this, because it explains a lot about what happened subsequently in the Italian campaign, and why someone like my father, who was a sergeant in the British Army, spent the next almost 2 years in Italy, because the initial hopes and aspirations that Rome would be quickly taken, the campaign would be, the front would close down. That failed to materialize. Just one last question, which is to do with the Italian armed forces. At this point, maybe 1.7 million men, maybe at least 1 million are in the Italian armed forces, in the Navy and the Air Force, and of course in the Army. People, historians generally say that the Italian armed forces were let down by the politicians in this period, and that they could have done more to protect the people and territory of Italy, and they were kept in ignorance and disarmed, and many turned into prisoners of war. What do you think now, 80 years on, Giulio?
So it's true that there was a lack of communication to the lower commands, also especially those abroad, because we have to remember there were several divisions in the Balkans, in Greece, in the Aegean, also in southern France, in Corsica. The problem with the army, and also partially of the Air Force, is that they were left with no clear orders. They were not given all these. There were orders that described what to do in the face of a German reaction. But these orders were not activated, basically, for the army and also mostly for the air force. So you have the situation where nobody's in the Ministry of War issuing orders, issuing directives. This is not the case of the Navy. Actually, the Navy leadership behaves in a very good way, let's say, because you have the minister, Admiral de Coutain, who instructs his sub chief of staff to stay at in Rome and continue issuing orders. The Navy units will receive orders until the afternoon of the 10th of September. So you have the situation in which the Italian Navy is basically saved, except of those ships that could not leave port because they were in dry docks, for instance. And so you have this very different outcome for the Navy, who continued to be a fighting force and also took part in the co-belligerent period. The few remaining aircraft of the Regia Aeronautica made it to the south and were able to reorganize later. The main drama is that of the army, who's left most widely left with few orders, and you have a lot of acts of heroism, like the massacre of the Acqui Division in Cephalonia, those troops that try to defend Rome. You have individual acts of valor all around, but then in many cases they are surrounded and disarmed by the Germans, where they have run out of ammunition, they are surrounded, and so on. And this is mostly because of the way the armistice was not prepared, let's say, for the armed forces, and especially the army.
Absolutely, so many tragedies for Italy and the Italian armed forces, and the Navy, of course, largely evaded the fate of the French fleet, because the French, after the occupation of Vichy in 1942, they scuttled the whole fleet. That didn't happen to the Italian Air Force. Look, Italian Navy. Well, thank you, Giulio Poggiaroni from the Italian Military Archives. Check him out. You can find him on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for coming on and such an exposition. I hope that you will join us again for another program in due course. So for the moment, thanks very much and goodbye. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you. That was Giulio Poggiaroni, who runs the Italian Archive page on YouTube. And so we're moving on to the final stage of the story, which is Operation Slapstick. Now we turn to Operation Slapstick. In operations leading to the Armistice, Italy offered to throw open Taranto and Brindisi to the Allies. But without a detailed agreement with Rome, the Allies decided to capture Taranto on the same day as the main landing south of Salerno to capture Naples. This would be achieved through amphibious landings by special forces, in this case Britain's 1st Parachute Division. They would then advance by land to Brindisi, 70 kilometers to the east, which was lightly defended by German forces. This would have the added advantage of diverting them from Salerno. Plans for what was named Operation Slapstick were finalized on the 6th of September. The Parachute Division with support troops left by Zerte by sea at 1700 on the 8th of September. As the Parachute Division approached Taranto in the afternoon of the 9th of September, the battleships Andrea Doria and Giulia with 3 cruisers passed them as the convoy set off to surrender to the Allies. A route through minefields was cleared by around 1700 and the landings began. There was no resistance and Taranto was immediately surrendered. The Parachute Division then advanced east towards Brindisi, north towards Gioia del Colle airfield, and west to link up with the 8th Army. The only casualties in the landings came on the 10th of September when HMS Abdeel, bringing follow-up troops, hit a mine in Taranto harbour and sank. more than 200 paratroopers and 48 crew were killed. The advancing paratroopers encountered determined but scattered resistance from German paratroopers. On the 9th of September, 1st Airborne's commanding officer Major General George Hopkinson was killed by machine gun fire while observing enemy positions near Castelnanata. The Pyros reached Brindisi on the 11th September, where Victor Emmanuel and Berdoli had arrived the previous day. Contact was made the same day with the 1st Canadian Division advancing from the west. Progress north was hindered by bad roads, the topography of the region, and German rearguards. The Gio del Colle airfield was secured after heavy fighting by the 24th of September. By then, Allied forces had broken out from their beachhead south of Salerno. The savage fighting there will be the subject of the next edition of This Week in the Italian Campaign. Well, thank you. Well, that's more or less it for this edition of This Week in the Italian Campaign. I hope you've enjoyed it. We will be back around this time every week, every Sunday from now on, bringing you the latest updates of facts and insights about this historic moment in European history. So from everybody at the This Week in the Italian Campaign live stream, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.